الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على المبعوث رحمة للعالمين سيدنا ومولانا محمد وعلى آله الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين الذين أذهب الله عنهم الرجس وطهرهم تطهيرا. قال الله تعالى في كتابه الكريم بعد أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم: يؤتي الحكمة من يشاء ومن يؤت الحكمة فقد أوتي خيرا كثيرا وما يذكر إلا أولي الألباب. This is an ayah from Surah Al-Baqarah. The ayah number is 269. Baqarah, of course, is the second surah. In the translation of the British Muslim scholar Muhammad Marmaduke Pickthall, rahimahullah, he giveth wisdom unto whom he will, and he unto whom wisdom is given, he truly hath received abundant good. Philosophy, falsafa, is none other than the love of wisdom, and wisdom, hikmah, is none other than abundant good. Moreover, it is not to be acquired through mere mental exertion and conceptual elaboration, for the attainment of wisdom ultimately is a divine gift. Yet, the exercise of the intellect, aql, is not to be abandoned, for it is none other than that which binds man to God. Such is the understanding of those who tread this path from among the Muslims. Giants of the caliber of Al-Farabi, who died 339 of the Hijrah, corresponding to 850 of the Common Era. Ibn Sina died 437 Hijrah, corresponding to 1037. Ibn Rushd died 595 Hijrah, corresponding to 1198. Mir Damad died 1041 Hijrah, 1631. And Mullah Sadra, who died 1050, corresponding to 1641, among so many others. However, the pursuit of wisdom is universal, and despite prevailing Western dogma, it is far from being a merely Hellenic miracle. That is to say, merely a product of the unique genius, as they would contend, of the ancient Greeks. On the contrary, the ancient Greeks are not unique in the history of mankind for philosophizing. We shall examine many examples, so we shall come across many instances in this course of lovers of wisdom from diverse cultures and civilizations. This dogma of Greek uniqueness, I wish to dwell on this for a few moments. This dogma of Greek uniqueness has been vigorously challenged in recent years by numerous researchers. Yet, the dogma persists. Now, I was under the impression we would have a whiteboard, but we do not, so listen carefully. The first of these vigorous challenges was mounted by Martin Bernal in his work entitled Black Athena. The full title, Black Athena, the Afro-Asiatic Roots of Civilization. This was published in New Brunswick, New Jersey by Rutgers University Press over a long span of decades, because it's in 3 volumes. The first volume was published 1987, Volume 2, 1991, Volume 3, as late or as recent as 2006. However, Bernal is not concerned with philosophy in the first instance in this work, but with the roots or origins of Western civilization itself, which he locates in ancient Egypt rather than in ancient Greece.
Could you repeat the last sentence?
However, he is not concerned with philosophy in the first instance, but with the roots of Western civilization itself, which he locates in ancient Egypt rather than ancient Greece. Now the subtitle is very telling, The Afro-Asiatic Origins of Civilization. Bernal, as is often the case in Western academia, he is not a classicist. That is to say, he's outside of the field. Yet he has made very, very, in my view, a very groundbreaking study. But he's not within the field. It's often the case that people who are entrenched in a particular discipline themselves acquire the status of a kind of clergy or church or nomenclatura from the communist world, where they sort of dictate what is acceptable and unacceptable discourse or scholarship. Bernal actually was a specialist in Chinese political history, if I'm not mistaken. Yet he is extremely talented. I believe it was his grandfather, his maternal grandfather, his Nana, who was a famous British Egyptologist. And he's a talented fellow, he's multilingual, and he became interested in the origins of the Greek alphabet, the writing system. And he realized that it actually goes back to Phoenician. Now this is not a profound realization, this isn't known, but it was for him because he's coming from the outside. Then he became very interested in, where does this come from? And he started going into the original Greek sources, the indigenous Greek tradition of if not history, but certainly of historical, cumulative, ancient Greek historical memory, which points to ancient Egypt as the source of their wisdom. Pythagoras, the very man who is credited with the invention of the term philosophy, is held to have spent an enormous amount of time in ancient Egypt. Now, modern scholars will say, well, this is all hagiography and this is, we don't accept this. But again, that's just a dogma. They never present any proof. What they should say, and they don't, is, well, we just don't like it. And they don't. But if you look at the actual tradition of Pythagoreanism, and it is a tradition of very long and venerable pedigree in the ancient world, there are Pythagorean works. There is a life of Pythagoras. There's more than one, in fact. The famous one is by Iamblichus, who's a very important later Platonist. You will also find the term Neoplatonism, which is a concoction of modern-day classical scholars. They themselves only spoke of the Platonic school, the madrasa of Aflatun. They didn't speak of Neoplatonism or New Platonism. And the reason, again, that these classical scholars use it is because in later Platonism, you find supposedly mystical tendencies or tendencies towards mysticism, towards irfan, towards what we would call tasawwuf and irfan, which they don't supposedly find in Plato, and they find this very disturbing. They think that, Plato is like some sort of modern academic misanthrope in his ivory tower or somewhere. In other words, Plato should be like them. In any case, so you find in the ancient Greek historical memory this notion that their culture, their greatest ideas, their greatest figures owe an immense debt to the ancient Egyptians. And he argues for this at length, and he calls it the Afro-Asiatic origins of civilization. Afro-Asiatic is a term from linguistics. It refers to language families. So we speak of the Romance languages. It doesn't mean that they're involved with maybe what this term means today. It means it goes back to the Romans, which means it goes back to Latin. So the Romance languages are, of course, Latin. And then from Latin, presumably, you get Spanish, Portuguese, Italian, French. What else? Romanian, Portuguese. So that's one language family. And you have sort of Germanic languages. In fact, English is an Indo-European or Indo-German, as would Romance be. And then there's another, so there's a major break. There's the Indo-European or Indo-Germanic or Indo-Germanic languages, and then there's the so-called Semitic languages. That's how they used to divide it up. And the most famous Semitic languages are Arabic, Hebrew, ancient Assyrian and Babylonian, which is usually referred to as Akkadian, classical Ethiopic, which is usually referred to as Ge'ez, and Aramaic, and there's many different kinds of Aramaic. Well, researchers in linguistics then found relationships between these Semitic languages, which are supposed to be in Arabia and the Fertile Crescent and this, but not in Africa. And they found supposedly connections between, let's say, Berber and let's say, although classical Ethiopic is African. Anyhow. So then they started calling it Afro-Asiatic. So he's trying to transfer this linguistic terminology or hypothesis also into the area of the history of languages. The history of the roots of civilization. So in the first volume, published in 1987, the subtitle is The Fabrication of Ancient Greece from 1785 to 1985. So he contends, and he's much better than Edward Said. You know, Edward Said also sort of argues about a certain kind of what he calls Orientalism in this book, which is an almost unreadable book. But this kind of Western bias and so forth. As very nice how Bernal does it. Bernal is much more solid. And he talks about how a kind of false image or a fabricated image was constructed of ancient Greece. So that Greece then becomes the origin of all Western civilization. And it sort of also betrays their own sort of aesthetics. You know, if you go to London and go to the Victoria and Albert Museum, for example, or if you go to the British Museum, you can go to the ancient Greek section. And you'll find all of these statues, very sort of anatomically correct statues, and they're all in marble and so forth. These statues were actually painted. The Parthenon was actually painted in gaudy colors. And when they realized this, they just went, no, that can't happen. It's a whole other sort of picture of what the Greeks were like, because otherwise they present this kind as a certain kind of very sublime art, and they could try to imitate it. And a lot of public buildings in the Western world are modeled off of Greek buildings. They're not painted gaudy colors, but the Parthenon was. So they construct a false sort of image of what the Greeks were, what the Greeks were like, and the Greeks, they're all very rational, and they invented geometry and physics and every other thing, right? So he challenges that very strongly. But again, he's not concerned so much with philosophy. In the second volume, he presents extensive archaeological and documentary evidence to support his hypothesis. And volume 3, he presents linguistic evidence. I have only seen volumes 1 and 2. As far as philosophy is concerned, a very robust case is made by an extremely talented Lithuanian scholar who became some kind of a Muslim. I say some kind because he was a follower of Fritjof Schuon, and that means you have to put a qualification there. And he is now deceased, and may Allah have mercy on his soul.
If I may interject a quick brief.
Of course, of course. By the way, I welcome questions and comments at any time. Yes.
Is that qualification because of the perennial philosophy, meaning from an Islamic perspective, we have a clear theology, but according to Fritjof and that perennial school, everything is sort of okay if you are into that tradition. Is that the reason for qualification, or is more than that?
That's the primary reason, but there's more. But that is a very important one. It's not so much the term perennial philosophy, but the doctrine espoused by Schuon in a book of the same name called The Transcendent Unity of Religions. So Algis Ujdavanis is his name. A-L-G-I-S and U-Z, and the Z has something like a V above it, D-A-V-A-N-I-S. And he wrote a book called Philosophy as Rite of Rebirth from Ancient Egypt to Neoplatonism. He uses this unfortunate term, Neoplatonism.
Philosophy as a rebirth?
Philosophy as Rite, R-I-T-E, of rebirth from Ancient Egypt to Neoplatonism. He's not talking about reincarnation. He's saying that, ignorance is a kind of death, and coming to knowledge and true wisdom is a kind of rebirth. That's the imagery. Anyhow, the contributions of another civilization of thoroughly ancient pedigree, namely Assyria and Babylon, is examined in depth by the Dutch scholar Mark van de Meeroep. Strange, I don't even know how to pronounce it. Mark is M-A-R-C, then van with a lowercase v, then space, capital D-E space, Meeroop, M-I-E-R-O-O-P. Anyhow, it's easier to search the book and find it. Philosophy before the Greeks, the pursuit of truth in ancient Babylonia. This is a very interesting book. All of these books which I've mentioned so far are very readable also. although they're treating very serious things, they're well written, they're very readable books.
So, I apologize, but just going back on,
Yeah, sure.
Pythagoras staying in Egypt.
Yeah, that's what,
Yeah. Is that where the story of him staying in front of a pyramid for a number of years until they actually invited him in?
I don't know if he stood in front of a pyramid, but he had to undergo some sort of a period of trial or testing before he was admitted into the temple, as they call it,
Okay.
whatever that means. In other words, before he was initiated into the mysteries of the ancient Egyptian teaching. And when we say mysteries, you see, there's another problem. People really don't know the English language anymore. Mystery isn't a murder mystery that they solve on some kind of weekly TV show. Mystery comes from the ancient Greek term mysterion, which means secret. Yeah. So these were esoteric teachings. These were teachings which were not revealed to all and sundry. What is this noise? This persistent noise.
It is the music and construction. 2 things are coming.
There's some kind of vibration and perturbations that are creating these. Anyhow, yeah. So I don't know if he stood in front of a pyramid. There's all sorts of stories. And again,
But the main idea.
Yes, the main idea is he spent a lot of time there. He was initiated into these secret teachings of the ancient Egyptians. And in fact, he based his own teaching or his own teaching was inspired by what he learned there, or was a Greek version, or I mean, it was something. Yeah.
But it's rooted from
Something, but which was rooted, very well said, in ancient Egyptian wisdom. So this is an important book by Van de Meerup that argues for an ancient Babylonian roots. And there again, he refers to ancient Greek sources, where the Greeks themselves talk about how the ancients of Babylon were deeply were very accomplished in philosophy. Finally, Central Asian and Indian influence on Greek philosophy have also been studied in 2 works. One is by Christopher L. Beckwith, much easier name finally, entitled Greek Buddha, Pyrrho's Encounter with Early Buddhism in Central Asia. Who is Pyrrho? Pyrrho is Pyrrho. Pyrrho is an ancient Greek figure. We don't know exactly when he lived. He lived between probably 275 and 365. Hold on, in BC you go backwards. So between 365 and 275 BCE. That's a big span of time. Somewhere in there was a guy named Pyrrho. And Pyrrho is associated with something called Pyrrhonism, or the skeptic school of ancient Greek philosophy. And his school was summarized by and written up by a guy named Sextus Empiricus. Sextus Empiricus. And honestly, if you read those texts, it does sound sometimes like you're reading something from the Pali canon of the Buddhists. Because they anyhow, so he argues that the Buddha himself, in fact, was not exactly an Indian, but he was even in the Indian tradition, they say he was from the Shakya clans, or what are the Shakyas, that he was what's called a Scythian, Scythian, some ancient people, which were in that region, and that there was an influence from that side to ancient Greece. And we know also that Alexander went to India, and that there were Greek colonies on the Indian frontier in Afghanistan, for example, and that there were Greeks then who stayed there, married and settled there, and they became Buddhists. There's a whole kind of Greek influenced Buddhist sculpture which I have seen in Pakistan, which is called the Gandhara. And Gandhara is actually Kandahar. And you got these Buddhas, and they look like Greek statues. You got these, Greek hair, very curly hair like this and beards and the gladiators. It's very famous. You can probably search some images on Google and find what I'm talking about. There's even in the Pali Canon, there's even a question of a kind of dialogue or debate that took place between a Greek king, who in Pali sources is called Milinda, with an I, and a Greek monk who's called Nagasena. It's called The Questions of King Milinda. And he was a known Greek king, and there's plenty of evidence that he existed, including numismatic evidence. You understand numismatic coins? Yeah. So Beck looks into these things in great detail, and I was going to write all the publication details on the board, but you can just go and search on Amazon, you'll find. Finally, the second book is probably the most comprehensive on Indic influence. It's a very well done book. The author spent more than I think 20 years. It's the kind of culmination of his research. And he was an art historian named Thomas McEvilley. Thomas McEvilley, M-C, lowercase c, then capital E-V-I-L-L-E-Y. It's called The Shape of Ancient Thought, Comparative Studies in Greek and Indian Thought. It's a very interesting book. So he argues for extensive travel and communication. The ancient world was not a kind of static thing as maybe some people think. People did travel around, and it wasn't as rare as you might think. There was international trade. There was a lot of exchange of ideas. And McEvilley argues very vigorously. And the thing about McEvilley is that he knows ancient Greek and Sanskrit. Beckwith also is not just some guy writing. He has put in the time and learned these languages, and he knows what he's talking about. You can agree, disagree. For that main part, Ujdavanish also knew numerous languages, including Arabic. And whenever he talks about the ancient Greeks, he always refers to the original Greek. Bernal also. These are guys who, they're not just sort of people with odd opinions, but they're people who have studied the languages and done the research. So these are important books. After these corrective observations, we shall now turn to Parmenides. Oh my God. Parmenides was active in the early part of the 5th century BCE. He is an extremely important figure for the study of ontology. That's what we are studying. Ontology is the study of being, of existence, of wujud. And as such, it is metaphysics, which is our topic. Although in metaphysics you also study a few other things. Ontology is specifically the study of being. A lot of people think, well, metaphysics is this area of philosophy where you study that which is beyond the physical, because that's what it means in metaphysics. I think they're very smart when they say that. And etymologically they're not really wrong, but that's not how the word came about. There's something very important for ancient philosophy and for Islamic philosophy as well, and that is Aristotle. So any of you who are really serious and you want to learn more about Islamic philosophy, you really have to read Aristotle. You have to study Aristotle. The problem is Aristotle is a notoriously difficult person to understand in terms of what survives. People say that he wrote dialogues and he was like Plato and he was very eloquent. Well, none of those dialogues survive. Not one, as far as I know. And again, we must be honest, I am not a scholar of ancient Greek. I do not know the language. I'm also going by translations. So I might be off on certain points. But for the most part, I think it should be solid. But you should go and try, and if you're really interested, find out about these things for yourself. So Aristotle, we have a large body of writings. And if you buy the complete works of Aristotle, Princeton University Press, there's 2 volumes. Each one is about this thick. Again, it's about the size of Plato, the complete Plato, 1,200, 1,300 pages, thin paper. If you read those, you get the impression that Aristotle is probably the worst writer who ever lived. Because it's just unbelievably difficult to understand what's going on. There's a terminology, there's all this, but he's extremely important. So what do you do? Well, it turns out there's a very easy book which can help you. It doesn't replace study, but it will give you an entryway. It's called Aristotle for Everybody. By Mortimer Adler. It's a very readable book. Aristotle for everybody. And by the way, a lot of the questions which were raised today about, can we know, is reason, etc., what we talked about earlier, he has written 3 very important books about philosophy. One is Aristotle for everybody. Then there's one called 10 Philosophical Mistakes. And then there's one called 6 Great Ideas. And they're really great titles. They're short books, and they're rather simple to read. I highly encourage you to look at those. So that gives you a way in. Then there's another more meatier book called Aristotle, A Guide for the Perplexed. Aristotle, A Guide for the Perplexed. I think it's by someone named Biella, something. It's obvious Catholic. It's usually only the Catholics now who are interested in Aristotle in a serious way. So that's also a very good book. Aristotle, A Guide for the Perplexed. It's a whole series, A Guide for the Perplexed. There's Heidegger, A Guide for the Perplexed. Frege, A Guide for the Perplexed. You name it. Philosopher X, A Guide for the Perplexed. It's a big series. And they're small, paperback books. And they're very readable. But the one, not all of them are really good, mind you. But the one for Aristotle is good, and I usually assign it. If you read these 2 books, then you can understand Ibn Sina, if you want to read Ibn Sina in translation. Ibn Sina had a very important book called the Kitab al-Shifa. It's a big book, but the section on the metaphysics is the Ilahiyat, and that you can buy as a dual language text with Arabic and facing page English, but again, when you're like, what's going on here? Because none of the terms, it's understood that you understand something about Aristotle. So Aristotle is credited with founding the subject of metaphysics, which is really our subject. And he wanted to make metaphysics the science of being as such. Al-wujud min haythu huwa al-wujud. Or being qua being. Being in itself. Not the existence of this cup. Not the existence of you and I. Not the existence of this world. But existence considered in and of itself. Okay? That's what he was trying to do. And Parmenides is a very early precursor. He's probably a pioneer in this field. I say probably because what in the world he's trying to say is extremely disputed. Okay. Yes.
So if you could elaborate maybe on
Sure.
so about the existence itself.
Yeah.
That phrase. A little bit more digging.
Existence considered in and of itself, irrespective of the existence of particular things. So on the level of conceptual elaboration, I can consider this plastic cup. And on the level of within my mind, I can analyze this cup into the qualities that make it a cup. In other words, it is a mathematically in geometry, its shape, I believe it's called a frustrum, isn't it? Truncated when you cut off the top of a cone. And so it has a particular radius at its base and a particular radius at its mouth because it's, conical shape without the pointed part. Yeah, it's made of a particular kind of plastic which comes from petroleum. It has all of these qualities that make it a cup and recognizable as a plastic cup in our society, and that's what we call it in the English language. All right, but this cup at some point didn't exist. It was manufactured. No one actually sat and made it. It was mass produced. So someone had to design the processes and the factory and so on and so forth that made it. So therefore we can conceive of a time when this cup didn't exist, when it wasn't made, it wasn't manufactured. And so we can, on the level of conceptual analysis, then distinguish its existence from what makes it a cup. It's that existence that we're interested in. And all of the qualities that make it a cup are called, in philosophical language, the quiddity. Quiddity, Q-U-I-D-D-I-T-Y.
All the qualities that make the cup, or I forgot the word you used.
It's a funny word which no one really uses anymore, but it's quiddity.
I heard of that word, but
Quiddity comes from a Latin phrase which is exactly what we say in Arabic. When in Arabic we ask what is it, we say ma huwa or ma hiya. And the term for quiddity in Arabic philosophical language is mahiya. In some older texts, I have even seen other words, but let's just stick with mahiya. And then the existence or the being is called wujud. Okay? So when we want to study in metaphysics, we are concerned with studying wujud only. not wujud as actualized as a cup or anything else. You understand? Now the term metaphysics comes about because these writings of Aristotle, which as I said are not easy to read, and I told you some books to help you, it is highly likely that these were his lecture notes. Now, as someone who lectures professionally, academic lectures, sometimes I write out, beautiful lecture notes like I've done today. And it doesn't mean I read them word for word, but they provide a framework. It's very important, especially when you have a 2 or 3 hour. If this was 50 minutes, you don't really need to do it. But if it's 2 or 3 hours, you don't want to be stuck somewhere because you might forget your train of thought, etc. It helps you, all right? And sometimes I might just write down a few little notes, like on this piece of paper, which was for the first day, all right? No one's going to know what this is. I know what this is. So with the writings of Aristotle, we basically have something like this. Not quite as bad as this, but just little phrases and things like this that he's written down, which he probably understood very well what he meant. And, well, why did that happen? Well, if you study about writing before the age of mass printing, you know that it's very fragile. I very much like calligraphy. I had the pleasure of making the acquaintance of some of you in the recent calligraphy class. You can spend a lot of time and you could write a whole copy of the Quran, and that's a very tangible, it's a hand-produced thing, and it's a beautiful thing. And it could last 1,000 years, if you really take care of it, if you've done the right paper and used the good inks and so forth. It can also go up in flames in a second. It's very perishable. And people think, well, now we have the iPad and we have this. That's even more perishable. It's gone. You don't even have to push a button. I think a very strong magnet can just bring it near your device, and you have serious trouble. Right? And it's also, if I want to write something, I can just go and lock it in a safe, and nobody can get it unless they actually break in. But now, they're probably watching you right now on your camera here. They're listening to everything. MashaAllah, they're competing with Allah. Okay? So things are very perishable. So various writings were lost. And it so happens that what we call the Aristotelian corpus ended up in Alexandria. Now, I don't know if a copy was made, if it was stolen. There are very interesting scholarly papers on how all this happened that you can go, if you have access to a good library, you can read about. Because the writings of Aristotle had his own school called the Lyceum. Plato had his own called the Academy. His writings were kept there. At some point, somehow, either those originals were stolen or a copy was made. Somehow, they end up in Alexandria, in the Library of Alexandria. And they're put all together by this guy named Andronicus of Rhodes. Andronicus then faced with a problem. What do we do with these weird notes that don't seem to fit anywhere? We'll just put them after the book he wrote on physics, and we'll call them metaphysics. Amazing. That's the story. Another variant of the story is that it wasn't, in the form of when the story is told this way, you think you've got a bound book. A bound book, a codex. It's called in Latin, a bound book is a codex. The ancient Greeks, they usually used scrolls. And the Library of Alexandria didn't have shelves. It had these little things where they put scrolls. At least that seems to be the consensus today. So the other variant of the story is that they didn't know where to shelve these scrolls, so they shelved them next to the text known as the physics. Now, ancient physics and ancient mathematics had a particular, in ancient mathematics you study what's called al-jism, in Arabic al-jism al-ta'limi, a mathematical body or a mathematical object. Whereas in physics you study an actual jism, an actual physical object and its motion, for example. Well, those are all existing things, mawjudat. And you're studying those mawjudat in some form or under some particular modality or understanding. But in metaphysics, you're not supposed to study any particular mawjud, any particular existing thing, but you are studying wujud itself, existence or being itself. All right? So Parmenides is a kind of pioneer in this respect. He is credited with a most recondite philosophical poem, which I originally wanted to assign, but then I realized that it wasn't going to work. Yes, go ahead.
Just to clarify.
Yes, of course.
Metaphysics, the existence is the study of the existence in itself, right?
So that notion of existence. If I use the word notion of existence, is that correct? No.
Yes and no.
Okay.
The notion of existence is the mafhum. Notion is mafhum in Arabic.
Okay.
So you have some notion, you have some mental idea of what existence is, or what wujud, or what being is. I prefer the term being as opposed to existence. We don't have to be very particular about all of this. Right now, in Arabic I mean wujud. So we can, and I think everyone is comfortable with the term wujud.
Yes.
Yep. We have a mental notion of it. Everyone has some mental notion. But that does not really exhaust what wujud is. In other words, what I mean is that everyone knows what the meaning of is, so to speak. If I speak of something, if I say the sky is blue, we will all understand what that means. Yes. We understand sky, we understand blue, and we understand the meaning of is. Now, if I say to you right now, it is raining, or the weather is rainy, I think I'm wrong. It was when I left, all right? And you could dispute that. You could dispute whether the weather, but you wouldn't dispute the meaning of the term is in this proposition. You say, look, no, it is not raining. Just look outside. Let's inspect the conditions outside this building. And in that disagreement, not much of a disagreement, it's easily settleable. We would not disagree on the meaning of is and is not. Now, I'm going to use a very mundane example now. If you want to say that The Planet of the Apes is a great movie, someone could dispute that. Assuming we understand which movie we're talking about. We've both seen the movie. We can disagree on whether it's a good or great or what movie, right? But we won't disagree on the meaning of the term is. Do you understand?
Yes.
So on that basis, everyone has a fundamental, even preconceptual grasp of what is meant by wujud. That is the notion of being. And wujud in that sense cannot even be defined. We're getting way ahead of the whole subject. That's the consent, that's what Mullah Sadra said, that's what Ibn Sina would say, that's what these, even Thomas Aquinas would say this. So wujud cannot be defined because it is the most general of terms. It conditions all cognition and concept formation. It cannot be defined. But at the same time, everyone has some basic notion of what it is. Its mafhum is among the most well-known of things. The famous philosopher, Islamic philosopher, Mullah Hadi Sabzawadi, who died in 1289 of the Hijrah, corresponding to 1873 of the Common Era. He's in the school of Mullah Sadra, the school of transcendent wisdom, al-hikmah al-muta'aliyah. He wrote a philosophical poem. Parmenides also wrote a philosophical poem, very interesting, in which he talks about being, and he says that مفهومه من أعرف الأشياء. Its notion is the most well-known of things. And he also says it can't be defined. He says معرف الوجود شرح الاسم ليس بالحد ولا بالرسم مفهومه من أعرف الأشياء وكنهه في غاية الخفاء. All defining terms of existence are but explications of the name or the term. They can neither be a definition in the strict Aristotelian sense of definition, nor a description, again, in the strict understanding of description in Aristotelian logic and classical logic. its notion is the most well-known of things, but its true reality, kunhuhu fi ghayat al-khafa'i, lies in the extremity of hiddenness. Because pure being, al-wujud al-mahdda, sheer being, al-wujud al-baht, is only God. Because God is pure existence. So, is it possible to truly know God? So, when you talk about wujud or being, everyone has a fundamental notion. When we speak philosophically or metaphysically or ontologically, we use the term wujud. If we want to speak theologically, we would speak of God. Here too, everyone has some vague and fundamental notion about what God is. Even an atheist, because that's what he's denying.
Wasn't Parmenides, like when he says the one, isn't just directly, because when I read that, I'm like,
yes. You have hit on a very important point. The Thomist philosophers, that is to say the philosophers of Thomas Aquinas, they speak of what are called the transcendentals. Things which are coextensive with being or wujud. Now they go about things a little bit differently than the Muslims do. So what are they? There's truth, beauty, the good, the transcendentals. Yes, let me just check this book out. Again, it's a similar system, and really a lot of what is really great in Aquinas is frankly taken from Muslims.
like justice?
Well, he's heavily into, he quotes, Ibn Sina a great deal and so forth.
Of course, Aquinas was acquainted with the Rush, right? I mean, that was the
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, the transcendentals, they are the true, the good, and one is also one of them. But in Muslim philosophy, they speak of and there's more than that. They say there's a whole range of transcendentals, and the way they frame the discussion in Thomist philosophy is very different. Anyhow, these are very technical points.
So how does it relate to consciousness, like being, existence?
All right, can you hold that for a second? Let me complete this. So, in Arabic, they speak of the tasawwuq or musawaqa, that is to say the coextensiveness of al-wahda wal-wujud, of unity and wujud. So wujud, or being, existence, is coextensive. In other words, it's convertible with oneness or unity, absolute unity, not arithmetical unity. Arithmetical unity is capable of superposition. You could take 1 and 1 and make 2. This is a non-arithmetical unity, in the sense that Zayd is a unique person. He is one, but he is unique. You can't take Zayd and add another Zayd and make 2 Zayds, even if they're identical twins. You understand? So that's what we mean. So there are terms which are coextensive with wujud, and wahda or unity is one of them. And that's why in the whole discourse by Parmenides on the one, what he says is also applicable because the two are coextensive, and he's using it in that sense with wujud. Yes. Now, you had a question.
Yeah, so we're talking about the existence, the being, or it is. So how does it relate to consciousness? It seems like I'm conscious is raining or not, right? So when we're talking about being, are we indirectly talking about being conscious? Or consciousness?
No, we're not, because the existence of the world is independent of you, unlike what Kant and other confused people might think. The existence of things is independent of whether you perceive them or not. So, there might be some 11th planet, I don't know if there is, with an extremely eccentric orbit, and we haven't bothered to, it hasn't registered on the horizon, as it were, of the modern astronomers and their instruments and their optical and other kinds of telescopes and so forth, but it may well be out there. A planet is maybe an outlandish example, but there are comets which, maybe the one will fly by, and we didn't know about it, and we hadn't charted it before. It has a bizarre orbit, and now so we know about it. Does that mean it didn't exist before that? There were people who doubted when world travelers such as Marco Polo and also Ibn Battuta returned. Some people doubted, more so with Marco Polo. The Muslims were rather well traveled. They may have found some of the things he said hard to believe, but they didn't dispute the existence of China. But I'm sure that there were people in Europe thinking that Marco Polo was making this all up. But does that mean that China doesn't exist just because you haven't been there, right? So, the existence of things is independent of your consciousness. I don't know if I've answered your question. Yeah.
I have a quick question on how did the Arabs really navigate the whole concept of is? Was it really like usually two terms of wujudiya and kauniya, or because they don't actually have the word is, and like they use kana, but it's a different
very good question.
Structure.
Yeah, that's a very good question. Did you fathom what she has to say? She said, how did the Arabs, and she means Arabs in particular because she has in mind the Arabic language, how did they navigate the question of is? Because there is no is in Arabic.
Yes.
The to be verb, which is really what is in English is an irregular verb. He is, I am. Irregular, there's no pattern, it's samahi. There's no way you can know how to conjugate it unless you learn it and grow up with it, right? And it's strange that in most languages the to be verb is an irregular verb. Like in Persian, which has a to be verb, it's budan. Okay? So I was, budam, I am, mikunam. Totally different. Turkish also has a copulate, this kind of to be verb. Urdu also has a to be verb. The Indo-European languages all have a to be verb. Where they put it in the sentence might be different. So for example, in Persian, Turkish, Urdu, it goes at the end, usually. Da 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 da, ast. XYZ, hay, in Urdu. You know, in Turkish, blah 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 blah. Dir, dur, dir, you know, takes a different vowel, but it's basically dir. It's the dal and the ra and Ottoman, and then you have to figure out what the vowel is. Arabic does not. This kind of to be verb, to be, is called the copula, the copulative verb. Now the Arabs knew what that was, and they have a word for it in Arabic. It's called ar-rabita. In Arabic grammar, ar-rabita or ar-rabita, without the ta marbuta. And there's a section on it. If you study traditional grammar, there's an early book which people read before the Alfiya of Ibn Malik called Khatr al-Nada wa Ball al-Sada by Ibn Hisham al-Ansari. He has a section on that. You'll find it in the traditional Arabic grammatical literature. But they're treating it more in a grammatic sense, because sometimes in Arabic you do have something which acts like a copula, like an is, such as huwa. But huwa is often called damiru sha'an in such cases. But in a simple nominal sentence, jumla ismiya, you don't have a copulative verb. You would say in English, Zayd is standing, to use normal examples that you usually do in grammar text. Zaydun qa'imun, right, in Arabic. So where's the copula? The copula is there by the very structure of juxtaposition of subject and predicate, or mubtada and khabar. So Zaydun qa'imun, right? Zayd is what?
Stand. Stand.
Yeah, it's
mubtada.
Yeah, it's mubtada. It's mubtada and it's marfu'. And qa'imun is al-khabar wal-khabar marfu'an bil-mubtada wal-mubtada marfu'an bil-ibtida'. You know, it's like, well, you can get into all these grammar things. Did you study these things?
Yes.
Yeah. So you know how it works. But it's just the juxtaposition of subject and predicate in Arabic brings about. So you have an implicit copula in the sense that you don't have a separate word fulfilling that function, but you have the notion of copula. Otherwise, ikhbar or predication becomes impossible. And clearly predication is possible, therefore the copula exists. You understand the reasoning there logically? What we just did. We studied logic.
Implicit, right? What are you trying to say? It's implicit.
It's implicit, yeah.
I mean, it's not.
Yeah.
The absence of it implies it.
Huh?
The absence of it implies it.
Well, the premise is predication is impossible without the copula. Okay? Is impossible without the copula. Predication exists in Arabic. Therefore, there is a copula, whether implicit or not, whether implicit or explicit.
How does huwa fit into all of this?
Qul huwa Allahu ahad. Or, sometimes they'll put a huwa which they don't really need, but it's there for emphasis. And that's called damiru sha'n in Arabic.
Isn't it also put in the case of the
You could say Zaydun huwa qa'imun, because you're really wanting to emphasize that he's standing up. There it's sort of damir sha'n. Of course, in Arabic, emphasis is also achievable in many ways. Inna Zaydan qa'imun. And sometimes the inna is just a dummy inna. It's not always for emphasis. It can come at the front of any jumla ismiya. Zaydun innahu qa'imun. You can say all kind of crazy things in Arabic. There's many ways of expressing yourself. But for the purposes of our discussion, copula is there in Arabic. Sometimes mainly implicit, sometimes explicit. And usually those explicit cases are often instances of emphasis. Anyway, that's...
And it needs the proper verb followed by common for the copula to exist, or it doesn't have to?
A proper verb followed by what?
A proper noun followed by common nakira,
It's an entire chapter.
Not exactly. Because sometimes the khabar can be a whole jumla, right? Sometimes the predicate can be a whole bunch of stuff.
And jumla is nakira. It's considered nakira.
No, jumla, I mean a whole sentence, a whole clause. Yeah.
But it's fi mahalli, it's considered nakira.
Yeah, if you want to get into all of that, sure. Yeah, we can do all that. Arab and all of this stuff is its own area. Yeah. Okay, so getting back to this, Sa'ad, do we have to vacate the premises in 5 minutes?
No.
Okay,
yeah, you can stay here as long as you want.
Okay, good. I thought we were ending by the hour or something.
Yeah, no, you're fine.
Okay. Right, so it's interesting that these kind of traditional philosophers often resort to poetry. In the case of ancient Greece, unlike with Mullah Hadi Sabzavadi, who's in the 19th century, it was much later, that was a compact form, easy for memorization. But in ancient Greece, the word poet or poetes is not just some literary figure. Usually people who had some sort of insight. And the same, interestingly, is true in pre-Islamic poetry. The sha'ir is someone like shu'ur. He has some sort of awareness that ordinary people don't have. And in fact, oftentimes a sha'ir in pre-Islamic Arabia would communicate with a jinn and would get his ideas from a jinn or get his words from a jinn. And this is the idea also that you have in ancient Greece of the muse, some sort of supernatural being who is inspiring you directly or indirectly with your literary composition. And in pre-Islamic poetry, this jinnic figure was called a hajis. Ha, do chashmi hai, ha, alif, jim, sin. Hajis. If you actually read some of the commentaries on things like the Malaqat, sometimes they'll give the name of the jinnic muse who was inspiring such and such poet. Anyhow, a poet is someone who has some sort of deep insight. And that's one reason that when the Quran was proclaimed by our Prophet ﷺ, some people said he is a poet. That's actually what they mean. It's not like saying today that E.E. Cummings is a poet. Was he a poet? Or did I just get that? And he wrote something, didn't he? Well, if we say Wordsworth was a poet, or Shelley, or... So that's what they don't mean. He's just some mere literary figure. They mean, he's involved with this real. It's not just profane literature, as we would say today. That he has some contact with the supernatural realm, and that's why they also accused him of being a kahin, a soothsayer. It's interesting that the word kahin in Arabic is cognate to the Hebrew word kohen, which means priest. The priests of the temple who are of Aaronic or descent from Harun, Prophet Harun alayhi salam. But in pre-Islamic Arabia, a soothsayer was someone who usually made some sort of pronouncement about the future in a peculiar kind of language, which wasn't poetry, but it had rhyme. Poetry in Arabic must have rhyme and meter. A soothsayer would speak in saj'a. Saj'un or saj'a is rhymed prose. There's qafiyah, rhyme, but there's no meter. There's no bahr or wazn. Okay? And this is also the reason that they said, A'udhu Billah, that the Prophet ﷺ was possessed. And the word for possession actually in that class is majnoon. Nowadays you use it as an insult to say someone's crazy. But it means that they have a jinn. Majnoon. You see? So you had similar ideas in the ancient world, all over the place, all over the ancient world. And so similarly in ancient Greece, a poet was someone who had some deep insight into things, had some access to the supernatural. And indeed, Parmenides doesn't start off his poem, and I'm going to say a few words about the poem. I didn't assign it because it isn't fully extant, it doesn't survive completely, and there are different versions that survive, and you really have to know Greek, which I don't, and anyhow. So I thought the better way was to just assign this dialogue, and I will try to connect it with that. So he's credited with this very recondite philosophical poem that examines the nature of being. There's also, as you know, a dialogue of Plato named after him in which he elaborates the nature of the one, which I have now pointed out. One is coextensive with wujud. But in this dialogue he elaborates the nature of the one after criticizing Plato's theory of ideas. So we'll examine this dialogue, skipping the portion on Platonic ideas, and focus on the one as being. As for the poem, etc., it is, as I just said, unfortunately no longer extant in its entirety. A comprehensive study of Parmenides, based on what survives of these texts, Parmenides the philosopher, not Parmenides the dialogue, has been authored by John Palmer. This is very recent research, published by Oxford University Press in 2009. Parmenides and Pre-Socratic Philosophy. Parmenides and Pre-Socratic Philosophy. So I want to just, in a few words, give you Palmer's interpretation. Then I will say a few words about this, and then we will just stop and we can have free discussion. Ila masha'Allah. Okay? So the poem opens not with him saying, well, being is like this and being is like that. Similarly, Sabzavani's poem doesn't open that way either. It opens with Alhamd and Salat on the Prophet ﷺ. I think he even mentions the notion of al-insan al-kamil, or maybe that's in his other poem, he has more than one. So similarly, there is this idea that he undertakes an allegorical journey to the realm of night, and is initiated, and he's taken there by the daughters of Helios, the daughters of the sun. Now, it was, oh, well, this is a polytheistic. A lot of this is just symbolism. We can have a whole discussion on the meaning of ancient polytheism and so forth. But the point is that he undergoes a journey. Similarly, in pre-Islamic poetry, I also think that pre-Islamic poetry served a kind of ritual function, because the pre-Islamic poet also in the poem undergoes a journey called the Rahil. So he undergoes a journey, Parmenides undergoes a journey, and it's a kind of allegorical journey. I don't actually think he went anywhere. And he is initiated into the ways of inquiry by Aletheia, goddess Aletheia, daughter of Zeus. Now, Aletheia, what is Aletheia in Greek? It's the name of the goddess, but Aletheia means truth. So it's the goddess Truth, that's the name. She initiates him into the ways of inquiry. Now, there is a very good web resource. A lot of stuff on the web is very suspect, but when it comes to philosophy, there is something put out by the Stanford University in California called the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. I like to print out, I don't like to read long things on the web. And so there is entry on Parmenides, the person, and then there's Parmenides, the dialogue, and it's called Plato's Parmenides, where the Parmenides would put in italics as a title of a text. And these are very useful. So there is a quotation, there are good quotations from the poem. Otherwise you have to buy Palmer's book, and it's very expensive. You know, when I was a professor, I always found ways of getting other people to pay for books. You know, you have access to funds and this and that, but we don't anymore. And so I'm printing these things out and doing this kind of thing. So, let's see. Parmenides, there's a quotation. I wanted to... Yes. So the goddess Aletheia initiates him into the ways of inquiry. And the poem states, "Come now," and she's speaking, Aletheia, goddess truth is speaking, "I shall tell and convey home the tale once you have heard, just which ways of inquiry alone there are for understanding." Then there's a colon. So, I mean, we would put a colon in ancient Greek, would be the one that it is and that it is not to be, is the path of conviction, for it attends upon true reality. But the other, that it is not and that it must not be, this, I tell you, is a path wholly without report. For neither could you apprehend what is not, for it is not to be accomplished, nor could you indicate it. Rather dense. That's why you should print it out or read it on screen and destroy your eyes. But you need to consider it. Palmer, John Palmer, author of Parmenides and Pre-Socratic Philosophy. You know, some people are very resourceful. Maybe you can find some quasi-legal PDF online or something. I don't know. But I actually have the book, but I can't find it right now. But luckily I made some notes on it. So Palmer interprets these ways of knowledge or inquiry in the mentioned by Aletheia, the goddess truth, as the fundamental modalities of being. The way it's written here is very, very wordy. You have to sort of read it and think about it, maybe even write it down. I have a friend in Cairo, a very good friend of mine, who's also a great calligrapher. And I did some calligraphy with him once upon a time. Ustad Ahmed Sultan, he once told me, this is very important, and he's a great scholar of Ibn Arabi also, although nobody knows him. If you're reading something, especially in Arabic, and you don't understand it, and you've read it a few times, that's obviously the first step, but you should write it out. Because when you write it, you're forced to slow down. And all of these people who take notes on their laptops and their other devices, and the professor's writing on the whiteboard or the chalkboard or the blackboard or the case may be, and they just sort of sit around and stare at the board, and then at the end, when the board is full, they take a picture of it with their device. They're doing themselves a disservice. Because you must involve your whole person in the process of talaqi, in the process of absorbing of knowledge. So when you are writing by hand, you are involving yourself. And especially if you're writing neatly or if you're doing calligraphy, you have to slow down. When you slow down, you give more consideration to what is written. And the serious kind of books, it's not, the Da Vinci Code is something you can read on the bus. Or the serious kinds of books like philosophy, especially Islamic books that are written in the Islamic tradition in Arabic, they're really not written to be read on the bus. And you have to remember that these guys weren't writing to sell books, like books like The Secret and the 7 Habits of the Highly Successful People, or whatever it's called. They were writing because they were preserving something worth preserving, and you usually couldn't go and buy a book, you had to copy it out yourself. So you would also be copying out. So when you copy, whether calligraphically or not, you slow down and you consider carefully. So you may have to do that with this passage. If you do something like that, if you give careful consideration, then you will understand what Palmer says. Palmer interprets these ways of inquiry as the fundamental modalities of being. Namely, necessary being, which we would call wajibul wujud, which is none other than Allah, which is none other than God. Then there is necessary non-being. Typically in English we call that the impossible or impossibility. Necessary non-being is the impossible, right? And then there is non-necessary being. You know, like this example we gave, this plastic cup, that doesn't have to exist. Someone made it and here it is, they manufactured it. And that's usually what is called the contingent in English philosophical terminology. So we have necessary being, then we have contingent being, and then we have impossible being or impossibility. In Arabic, these are simply called, without putting wujud every time, we'll say al-wajib, that's the necessary, al-mumtana', the impossible. That's the proper philosophical word for impossible. In modern Arabic and also in classical Arabic, they often say mustahil. But what you really, in philosophical language, they usually use the term mumtana'. Because if you take mustahil and take the masdar and make istihala, istihala also means transformation. Okay, so you use the term, because I know some of you are interested in Arabic and Islamic studies, so I'm giving these little footnotes. So you have al-wajib, wal-mumtana'. Wajib is necessary, mumtana' is impossible. And then, what do you think contingent is? It's mumkin. So mumkin you can translate as possible as well, but what you really mean is that it is contingent. In other words, the existence or the wujud of this plastic cup is contingent on a nexus of causes. You know, the factory, the manufacturing process, the designer of the factory, the industrial engineers, it's a whole nexus. It's not just simple cause and effect. I light a match and set a piece of cotton on fire. It's a nexus, it's a network of causes, but it is nevertheless dependent on those things, therefore it is contingent.
Is that what Sheikh Khalil likes to say as harfi?
I don't know, I've never taken a class with Sheikh Khalil. I only know him socially and I only got to know him briefly existence. And then he left. So
yes, he talks about existence in terms of like ismi and harfi. So he likes
okay.
Do you get
Grammatically
that?
speaking, harf is dependent on something, so I don't recall him saying
no,
that.
No, he went on a further discussion on like...
I don't know, I would have to see the text that he's getting that from to, you know, because sometimes, I don't know where he's getting, you know, sometimes philosophical texts they are different, kalam texts different, sometimes when they, you have to be very careful when you read also, like to know how people are using terms.
So
I can't really, I don't know, I'm sorry.
So like our existence is contingent.
Our existence is contingent on lots of things. Yeah, that's right. So actually the totality of things other than God, which is signified by the term in Arabic, al-alam, which means the world. It doesn't mean planet Earth, it means the whole universe, the cosmos. All of that is contingent on God. Yeah. All right.
So in that spectrum, what is necessary?
I'm just going to stand up. I find these chairs to be just comfortable.
They are.
Proceed.
So, what is? How do I understand al-mumtana?
How do you understand mumtana? Something which is impossible. The kalam and philosophers, they love to give the example, sharikul bari. You know, a partner with God is impossible. It has a wujud dhihni, it has a mental existence. Just you can think, oh yeah, well, God having a partner. Of course, that's impossible. Granted, this has been disputed for a long time by Christians, but that doesn't change the fact that one can dispute with them, right? So it's, or other impossible things. You know, I don't know about veterinary science, I don't know about medical science, but there is a phenomenon called albinism, right? Mm-hmm. And it is there among human beings. I don't know if it exists among animals. But typically, raven, the bird known as the raven, is black. I don't know if there are white ravens, so you could say, well, a white raven. And then you say, well, occasionally there are, because of ornithological albinism, I don't know if it exists. You would say, well, what about a blue raven? I don't think you have, so that's again something impossible. I remember when my daughter, she's now about 20, when she was 3, she said, we need to get a blue cat. And I said, blue cats don't exist. She said, well, what if we get a white one and paint it blue? Have you ever tried to paint a cat? Anyway. You got that? So that's the mumtana. A realm of things that just simply can't exist. Square circles, a triangle in a plane with 900 degrees, doesn't work. Every triangle in a plane is 180 degrees by definition of triangle in a plane.
So
Okay.
is it always by definition or no?
Well, that's what we call a triangle. It's a three-sided figure, but actually it turns out no matter what you do in a plane, if you have a three-sided closed figure, it will always add up to 180 degrees.
No, I'm saying the actual term is only like, when you go about applying it, do the term's definition then cause the impossibility? Or is it more things than just the definition of that term?
There are instances where you could end up with that, yeah.
Okay.
I think Parmenides used the nothing as non-being, right?
That's nothing, exactly. That's true. All right, so there we are. So Palmer interprets these ways of knowing or inquiry that Aletheia, the goddess of truth, unveils to him in the poem, and that's really what I want you to get out of the poem. That we have these three modalities of being: what must be, in other words now, what must be, which is wajib, what must not be and cannot be, the mumtana, and what is but need not be, to put it in very simple language. All right, so Palmer really goes really far. He considers Parmenides to be the first to introduce these ontological, these model distinctions in ontology, or these modes in the science of being. And he also considers him not only the first person to introduce them, but the first person to really to explore them in detail. And that's why his book is, Parmenides and the pre-Socratics. The pre-Socratic philosophers didn't have this conception according to Palmer. Moreover, Palmer has also argued in another work entitled Plato's Reception of Parmenides that Plato saw, this is the key point, this connects us to the dialogue. Plato saw, and this is a direct quote from, I think, the first page of Palmer, the opening chapter, that, and I quote, that Plato saw in Parmenides a forerunner of the ontological and epistemological distinctions central to his own philosophical outlook.
Can you repeat that?
Yes? The direct quote is, and I took it from the middle, that Plato saw in Parmenides a forerunner of the ontological and epistemological distinctions central to his own philosophical outlook. Okay, that's from the opening paragraph of John Palmer's book.
That can also say a challenge to this idea. When you say distinction,
yeah.
Does it imply that Parmenides' idea is a challenge to what Plato thought about the idea of existence?
I don't think, at least the way he's portrayed there, I don't think so. And people argue, well, is this an accurate portrayal of Parmenides? I mean, I think so. I think it is. They were much closer to him than we are, and you can disagree. I mean, honestly, can I have my Plato's, please? Because I need. Yeah, thank you. There was a curriculum in the ancient world, in the Platonic tradition, of how one would go about studying these dialogues of Plato. So there was a progressive sequence in which they were supposed to be read, going from the easier to the more difficult. What do you think is the most difficult? It's the Parmenides. What comes just before Parmenides? The Timaeus. And these were considered to be the most difficult dialogues, and the modern people can't stand them, especially the Parmenides. Like, look at Cornford. Cornford has a little comment. He's the translator. What Cornford says is very English. What does he say? Cornford, page 920. The Parmenides presents a great difficulty to the reader. You have to imagine this English guy. The best Platonists differ about its meaning. The ordinary person will be hard put to discover any meaning at all. That's the opening sentence introducing it, and you think, maybe. So much encouragement to read it, right? The argument runs on and on in words that appear to make sense and yet convey nothing to the mind. Examples are on every page. As for instance, he gives an example, but that's the way most people looked at Parmenides, and they just sort of read through it as an act of obedience or whatever, a heroic sort of effort to read all of these dialogues. But other people take him very seriously, and there's a whole range of interpretations on what he means, and you can, if you're interested in following this up, you can go and look in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. They give all kinds of arguments and interpretations. But the fundamental doctrine of the Platonic schools, as you see, this is what these guys don't like. They don't see it as a tradition. They want to invent something, which is what Martin Bernal really points out very nicely, that they have this fake view of the ancient Greeks. This was a tradition that goes from Plato all the way up. The last sort of really great figure in Platonism is Proclus. Where's Proclus? Anyway, here he died in 485 of the Common Era, I think. I have him on my list here. Proclus, yeah, 485. He lived from 410 to 485 of the Christian era, of the Common Era. He wrote commentaries on everything. That is, he wrote commentaries on all of Plato and on all of Aristotle. A lot of them have been lost, though. Some of them are in fragments, as is often the case. He also wrote a full commentary on Euclid. He also wrote a full commentary on Ptolemy's Almagest, which is a very important work of mathematical astronomy. Ptolemy also wrote a book called the Tetrabiblos on astrology. So this whole approach to Platonism is wrong. Parmenides, in his poem, he's obviously someone who is practicing some sort of a spiritual discipline as well. And this is what has happened. Modern philosophy is just viewed as mere, what did I say at the beginning? Wisdom is a gift, ultimately. You have to exercise reason. That's why it's وَمَنْ يُؤْتَ الْحِكْمَةِ in the Quran. And he who hath been given wisdom hath been given abundant good. It has to be given, but you've got to do something on your side to get it. It's not just going to happen sitting around, right? You have to exercise your reason. So there is a spiritual dimension as well. Socrates, if you read about Socrates, he gave his life for wisdom. He was executed. That's a whole other discussion. That's another lecture. That's another class. These are profoundly important things. And until modern times, the only person who sort of really tried to re-emphasize this and was given some sort of acceptance in the modern academy is a French guy, a French academic named Pierre Hadot, Hadot. I don't really think he has said anything profound. I mean, the fact that Hadot even had to write the book and argue this is just a sad commentary on the utter stupidity of the modern academy, really, to put it extremely bluntly. It's very clear that these people were practicing some sort of spiritual discipline, but they ignore all the biographical literature that's there. They ignore, for example, there's a whole biography of Plotinus, the two real giants in Platonism, and they are heavily indebted to Parmenides. There's Proclus, and there's also Plotinus, who died in 270, lived from 204 to 270 after Christ, in the Common Era, the Christian era. Plotinus has his own writings known as the Enneads. Enneads just means the nines, because they come in groups of nines. There's I think 54 treatises divided into 6. 9 times 6 is 54. Plotinus' whole concern is like that of Parmenides in how he's quoted in the dialogue called the Parmenides, concerned with the one and elaborating the nature of the one. So these people were practicing some kind of a spiritual discipline. The disciple of Plotinus is Porphyry. Porphyry is the same guy as the Isahuji. He wrote the Isahuji. He wrote a biography of Plotinus. He said that Plotinus used to do some kind of a meditation. Now, how come we don't find much discussion? Because this stuff was secret. It's just like tasawwuf is pretty secret today too. Well, you know that they're doing stuff, but they don't really tell you what they're doing because you don't need to know. Well, the Greek, but we actually know a lot. But the Greeks were extremely tight-lipped. We have very little idea. There are all sorts of so-called mystery religions or esoteric religions. There was one called the Orphic, the cult of Orpheus. There was one called so there's the Orphic mysteries. There's the Eleusinian mysteries. There was Mithraism. There's no text. Everybody's very quiet, tight-lipped about it. Nobody knows. And what we do know, we don't understand. So they were doing things. And the Parmenides was studied. And there was no sort of dichotomy between Aristotle and Plato as modern classicists try and make it out. It was a whole curriculum. Plato, the complete Plato and the complete writings of Aristotle was a curriculum that these guys studied. It was maybe their exoteric doctrine, what they studied. And they also studied mathematics and geometry, so there was a Pythagorean element as well. I don't know if anybody has studied Euclid from the original. Has anyone? I didn't do it in school, but I have the book, and if you read it, it's very different from modern sort of geometry. And Proclus is of the opinion, they actually teach that the whole study of Euclid was built up, and it concludes with the study of the Platonic solids. They're also called the Pythagorean solids. Do you know there's the cube, the tetrahedron, the octahedron, the dodecahedron, and the icosahedron? The tetrahedron has triangular faces. So the cube has square faces. The octahedron, again, is triangles, is joined this way. There's 4 here, 4, so there's 8. The dodecahedron is pentagons, all joined together. The icosahedron, dodecahedron has 12 sides. Icosahedron has 20 sides. It's equilateral triangles, all joined together. So you think, oh yeah, well, so what? Well, it was a kind of esoteric teaching. We were building up to the study of the Pythagorean or the Platonic solids, because if you read the Timaeus, if you read Plato, you find out that actually, is it in the Timaeus? I think it's somewhere else. It may not be in the Timaeus, but somewhere, I don't remember where now off the top of my head. Socrates talks about the whole universe actually consisting of 12, and that's the dodecahedron. So the dodecahedron in ancient Pythagorean doctrine was seen as a symbol of the universe. And this is not just a bunch of, like hippies sitting around looking at some shape just tripping out. If you actually, there are deep truths here. If you study the relationships, the angles, it's a very complex shape. And you can't really appreciate what's going on unless you build a model of it. I've done it. You must go home and you must build a model.
So, Professor, the
yes.
spirituality of the pre-Socratic Greeks is based on reason, not revelation. Is that, can I say that?
No, you can't. We don't know what the revelation was. They must have had a revelation. وَلِكُلِّ أُمَّةٍ رَسُولٌ. It says in the Quran, every human collectivity has received a messenger. I don't know, maybe Socrates was a messenger. I can't say for sure that he was, but you cannot say for sure that he was not. Because he comes before the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He may have been. We don't know.
I was trying to connect with the beginning question. Through pure reason we can find the truth. Right? So really revelation is not needed to find the truth and to experience the spirituality. And since they did not mention about revelation, then we can conclude it's based on reason.
Yeah, that is a question.
Not really, because different civilizations have had a different understanding of revelation. What do you understand by revelation? In the Islamic context, it will be very specific. That it's mind you, you'll be hard put to find a definition in these books, but if you actually go through and look at our sources and so forth, you have to conclude that the revelation and wahi actually is used also not in that strict sense in the Quran as well. Because wahi is given to the mother of Moses that she should put her son in the that's the verb that's used. Does that mean she was a prophetess? No. So wahi also
Ibn Hazm would argue that, right?
I don't know if Ibn Hazm did or not.
Yeah, basically like those figures, not a prophet, Nabi, he uses the term Nabi.
I don't know, I haven't consulted Ibn Hazm. Does he have something to say on that?
Yeah, I read an article on that.
Okay.
Similarly, Maryam, alayhi salam.
Yeah. Well, she doesn't have a revelation, but it's in the sense that it's a specific communication given to a person, and that communication has to be addressed to people. It's not a private sort of thing. That's what a risala is. If a person is a rasul, if they are a nabiul mursal, if they are a nabiul mursal, then there's a particular character. But if there's just a nabi, sometimes a nabi was just a private individual and he received some kind of a revelation. But wahi then has to be really understood, if we take it in that strict sense, as communication by Allah through an angel. All right. But then, what is an angel? We get into a whole other area of discussion and debate. And so, aql itself is a kind of thing that yakshif, that unveils the unknown. Yes. And so it depends on how you construe the term revelation. We can't say that the Greeks, maybe Homer's Iliad was a revelation to the angel. I don't know. And there are different versions, I don't know Greek, but they had to have received some kind of a revelation, because every human collectivity has received a Rasul. And whether they will remain true to it or not is a whole other discussion and debate. But then it raises other questions in terms of actual acts of worship and rites and so forth. I think these have to be established by a Nabi Mursal through a direct communication from God. Because it becomes part of a Sharia. You can't just make up a Sharia, right? But in terms of ultimate metaphysical truths, these are discoverable. These are discoverable. Parmenides did not have the Quran. He's talking about the one. He's talking such a pure Tawheed here that at times it reads like Muhyiddin ibn Arabi, or reads like something from our tradition. Just to jump ahead now, because we're basically in the free-form discussion. Essentially, he is saying that yes, you have the one, you don't have the one. In other words, when you talk about the ultimate truth, you can make positive statements, you can make negative statements, and you can even make paradoxical statements. Because on the one hand, Allah is completely other. He is completely other in the sense that his transcendence, his tanzih, his incomparability, if you like the William C. Chittick translation of the term, is laysa kamithlihi shay. The Wahhabis love this one. Laysa kamithlihi shay, Baba. There is nothing like him. Yes, but the ayah continues. وَهُوَ السَّمِيعُ الْبَصِيرُ. You have sama, I have sama, a cat has sama, a bat has extraordinary capacity for audition, for hearing, right? And we see as well. By virtue of Allah, He's created. By the blessing of Allah, He has created in human beings and other living creatures the power or the sense or the capacity of vision and sight. Similarly, that of audition. So that is a similarity, or in theological language in English they speak of transcendence and immanence with an I, or tanzih and tashbih in Arabic. Tanzih, translated maybe more simpler or direct English, is incomparability, and tashbih is comparability. So Allah is both present and absent. That's really what's going on in this dialogue, among many other things.
Yeah, I can see
لَيْسَ كَمِثْلِهِ شَيْءٌ وَهُوَ السَّمِيعُ الْبَصِيرُ. If you read in the Fusus al-Hikam, you're very interested in Arabic. If you read Fusus al-Hikam, chapter 3, the third fuss, I think it is, or the fourth, isn't it? Because the first one is Adam, then there's Sheath, and then, no, I think it's the third, it's Nuh. Nuh is the third one. Ibn Arabi talks about this whole business about tanzih and tashbih. And he says that if someone does complete tanzih, they think they are presenting a pure view of God, completely unlimited, but they're actually limiting Him, because tanzih itself is a kind of taqyid, and as is tashbih. And the true knower, and he uses the term imam, the true imam in the science of tawheed, is one who combines tanzih and tashbih. And he argues that in the ayah, لَيْسَ كَمِثْلِهِ شَيْءٌ وَهُوَ السَّمِيعُ الْبَصِيرُ, you have both tanzih and tashbih. even if you drop the وَهُوَ السَّمِيعُ الْبَصِيرُ part, because you have لَيْسَ كَمِثْلِهِ. In Arabic grammar, that kaf is kafun za'ida. You don't need it. You could say لَيْسَ مِثْلِهِ شَيْء. So what does it mean? So he goes on, and there's things in the Futuhat as well. So you must combine tanzih and tashbih. Allah is both present and absent. Allah is totally other, but He is reflected in the whole creation. And because He is reflected in the whole creation, He is eminently knowable through the creation. And so He is knowable, and therefore He and divine truths, metaphysical truths are discoverable. In another surah in the Quran, I will quote with this and then I will leave it open again for free-form discussion. It says in Surah Fussilat, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, سَنُرِيهِمْ آيَاتِنَا فِي الْآفَاقِ وَفِي أَنفُسِهِمْ حَتَّى يَتَبَيَّنَ لَهُمْ أَنَّهُ الْحَقِّ. We will show them our signs on the horizons, يعني في العالم الخارجي وفي أنفسهم, and within the world within and the world without. آياتنا, our signs, our portents. حَتَّى يَتَبَيَّنَ لَهُمْ, until it becomes manifestly clear unto them أَنَّهُ الْحَقِّ, that He is the utterly real, the absolutely true. Well, those signs and portents were there in the time of Parmenides. They were there in the time of Plato, Aristotle, etc., the pre-Socratics, and they've been present everywhere from the beginning of creation. Therefore, I argue that if one contemplates this text, the cosmos as book, these are ayat, just like the ayat of the Quran, then you can come to an understanding. Also, of course, with divine tawfiq and so on. But how? You must contemplate, these signs. And the Quran also says, do they not, contemplate the alternation of night and day, اختلاف الليل والنهار, etc. تولج الليل في النهار وتولج النهار في الليل ويخرج الحي من الميت والميت من الحي, etc. All of these things are there, right?
So when I was reading Parmenides, he used the word being in singular terms.
Mm-hmm.
So what he's really talking when he say being is mean only one exists and everything else doesn't exist? I'm kind of confused on that.
Okay, this is important. So essentially what is happening now in Parmenides, the dialogue Parmenides, yes.
Parmenides,
He's both affirming the one and denying the one at the same time. What is he up to?
The way you construct is like this premise, this
yes.
Then
You have to deconstruct the whole thing. You have to chart it out. It's an elaborate task. And it's done in the context, really, of trying to salvage the theory of forms. So what is this theory of forms? Let me just elaborate on this, and then we will hopefully be able to move further with that. Now, Plato says that everything in the universe is actually the reflection of an ideal form or Platonic idea or image exemplar, which is in the world of these ideal forms. And he actually uses the term in Greek, it's ideos or something like that, from which we get the word idea. But sometimes they talk in English about the theory of forms, Platonic ideas. Now they don't use this, but I would use the term the image exemplars. The image exemplars. So we have various things which are quite concrete, like cups, tables, chairs, cats, dogs, trees, birds, bees, flowers, trees. But then we have things which are quite abstract as well. So you would say, if you look again at our plastic cup, this is round. The mouth of the cup is round. The base is round. The lid on this bottle of water is round. And we have some concept of roundness. Now, he says that this concept of roundness is, all instances of roundness are actually, all instances of roundness or of circles or roundness or curve, are in the external world, in our world, instantiations of an ideal form or idea or image exemplar in the world of forms, which is not a physical thing. Similarly, we have things which we don't have physical instantiations of, such as justice, truth, beauty, etc. We can have a physical instantiation of circle, Again, it's not a perfect circle because it has a thickness, there's an imperfect, So there's some perfect image of that, and he believes those really exist. That is a kind of Platonic idealism. It's not Kantian idealism. It's not Immanuel Kant. That's a whole other thing. So this is also called idealism. His supposedly, and I think this is totally wrong, supposedly his student Aristotle repudiates the theory of ideas or the doctrine of Platonic forms, and espouses what is called realism, which is adopted by the Catholic thinker Aquinas. Whereas no, there is no magical world of forms. These are in our mind and they are instantiated, but we get the idea of the ideas through an abstract process of abstraction. We look at all of these circular things and we say, oh, well, there's that ideal circle. And we can see instances of justice. We can see a person being just to another person, for example. We can see a person oppressing a person. From that we derive this idea of justice. So that's a kind of real, it's real, but it's not in this, often some ideal world. The more extreme position is this notion of nominalism. Well, these are just terms, and that comes later. Anyhow. So Plato wants to defend this idea. Now, and it's interesting that this also had a great resonance in the Islamic world. Because Muhyiddin ibn al-Arabi, and that's where I get the word image exemplars, he speaks of things called al-a'yan al-thabita. Al-a'yan al-thabita. Al-a'yan is plural of ayn. Thabit means fixed. So you would translate that directly or literally as fixed entities. That's one translation. But ideal source forms, image exemplars, what he is saying is that everything in the universe, he's not a philosopher. Ibn al-Arabi, in fact, doesn't write clearly at all. He writes very beautiful Arabic. But he doesn't write clear philosophical Arabic like Ibn Rushd, or another very clear writer who was not a philosopher, but he wrote very clear, crisp Arabic is Al-Ghazali. Ibn Arabi writes beautiful Arabic, but he doesn't write these kind of systematic didactic treatises. He's writing under a kind of ilhamic state of inspiration. And the Arabic is really good. Literarily, it's very profound. But it's not a very organized kind of book. But if you read carefully, then you can understand that he is espousing a doctrine in which he says that everything in the universe is a manifestation or a reflection or a locus of manifestation of a divine name. And each thing has a fixed entity, which it is a reflection of. And it's a reflection of that divine name. So these a'yan al-thabit are very much like the Platonic ideas. The mystical, philosophical thinker Suhrawardi al-Maqtul, who died in 587 of the Hijrah, 1191 Common Era. Suhrawardi also had such a doctrine, except he spoke of, he was very interested in logic and he was very philosophical also. But he had this profoundly mystical side like Ibn Arabi. He was executed, by the way, by the son of Salahuddin, reluctantly on the orders of Salahuddin. Yes, the Salahuddin.
Reason being?
This is the same issue of...
there was a case brought against him by the ulama who didn't like him because he became very close to the son of Salahuddin. And people are people, and they became jealous of him, and they accused him of either claiming to be a prophet or saying there could be a prophet after Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And that's supposedly the charge he was executed on. But Suhrawardi was a very talented person, and he did not suffer fools gladly. And that's probably why there was this reaction and why he really was executed and stuff like this. I really don't know all of the details. And I don't even know if I don't even know if anyone's actually written about the actual politics and conspiracy that was involved in having him executed. But he was an extremely creative person. and an extremely brilliant mind. And you can see that he also wrote beautiful Arabic. And he also wrote treatises in Persian as well. But mainly his writing is in Arabic. The Hikmatul Ishraq, also translated in Arabic in the same, Brigham Young University series of Islamic philosophy. So he also had a similar notion of these fixed entities, although he called them by a different term. He called them Arbabul Anwa'a, the lords of the species, using the logical term Nawr. And anyhow.
Could this be the same thing as what's referred to in the divine story of Allah teaching Adam the isms of everything?
Yes, it is my understanding, wallahu a'lam, that what is meant by وَعَلَّمَ آدَمَ الْأَسْمَاءَ كُلَّهَا, that these are not language, these are not names, these are the universals. If you want to take a philosophical tafsir or ta'wil of this ayah, what is meant, wallahu a'lam, by asma is universals. And on that interpretation, then Adam, we don't take him literally to be the first human being. I mean, we do, but he is symbolic also, and is standing in for the whole of humanity, you understand? Because we then inherit from him this innate capacity to understand universals. Because Allah also says, وَنَفَخْتُ فِيهِ مِنْ رُوحِي, and I breathed into him of my spirit. So what does that mean? What is the human soul? Later in Islamic psychological writings, that nothing to do. Psychology means the study of the soul. Psychology from the Greek psyche, meaning soul. Now in Islamic philosophical writing, they often use, not in the Quran, I understand the Quran, it has various other meanings, but in philosophical Arabic, ruh and nafs are often used interchangeably. Okay? Yes. So they will say that the nafs of the human being is an-nafs an-natiqa, the rational soul. And this goes back to, again, Aristotle. Aristotle has a very important book called Peripsyche, on the soul, or in the Latin version, De Anima. Even in English, they often call it De Anima, on the soul. It's a very important book. So he says that the soul, again, I'm sort of summarizing and paraphrasing Aristotle. He actually gives a very strict definition, but if I give the definition, then we have to explain a bunch of words. Essentially, he's arguing that the soul, or soul as such, an-nafs min haythu hiya an-nafs, soul as such, is the principle of life in all things that live. And he considered plants to be living things. And anyone who's kept plants, and they live.
Soul is what?
The principle of life in all living things. And so you have the plant soul, or an-nafs an-nabatiya, the vegetative soul it's called usually. Then you have the animal soul, which you find in cats and dogs and other fish, right? And then you have the human soul. But the human soul is not called an-nafs al-insaniya or something. It's called an-nafs an-natiqa. What does natiqa mean? Natiqa means both speech, but it also means reason. And what distinguishes, human beings are distinguished from animals. A cat or a dog has a certain amount of deliberative sense. It can decide to eat or not eat, or drink that cup of milk or not. But it acts ultimately and is motivated by instinct. An animal is not capable of cognizing universals. And that's really the whole conspiracy behind the movie The Planet of the Apes. Excuse me, The Planet of the Apes is on my mind these days. That's really what they're trying to do. It's all part of evolution, and apes are people too, and this kind of thing. And it's true, they have been able to teach some apes some sign language and so forth, but they do not cognize universals. Nor do dolphins. There's all sorts of things out there in the popular culture, which really is not really designed just for entertainment. It's also designed for programming. That's why it's called programming. TV programming is for programming. So animals do not have that ability. And I believe that is the meaning of وَعَلَّمَ آدَمَ الْأَسْمَاءَ كُلَّهَا. And Adam was taught, primordial man, Adamic humanity, has been endowed by Allah, by their Creator, with the capacity to cognize universals. That's very important. Even a guy who's a complete atheist, Chomsky, Noam Chomsky is an atheist. He's very correct on the Palestinian issue, but he's wrong about God. And that's his other great claim to fame. He writes a lot about political issues. He's a complete Marxist, etc., etc. But he is a very profound linguist as well. He observed, and it's a very important observation, that there is really no way to explain how a human child can learn a language as fast as it can, unless there's some innate language thing, and they say it's in the brain, it's a result of evolution, yada, yada, yada. Yeah? But it's a very important observation. How is that possible? You know, for example, my second daughter was very eloquent, even at a very young age. Even when she was 3, she would speak complete sentences. So you have maybe some different degrees of sophistication among certain children, some being more precocious than the others. But how did she know that? Now, she doesn't know specifically. If I asked her what is a subject and a verb and this, she wouldn't know. But she's using them correctly. And I say to you, how? And Chomsky also said how. And he says, well, there's some sort of a faculty. Aha. How is that possible? وَعَلَّمَ آدَمَ الْأَسْمَاءِ. It's not that he taught Adam that this is a cat, and this is a dog, and this is a this, and this is a that. It's that innate capacity, and that's the distinction, the ability to cognize universals. Yes, ma'am. Dr. Fazan.
Yeah, I've always been concerned about the use of insan as being, you know, the speaking animal, haywan, that description, because it doesn't take into account this component, you know, no matter they're talking about artificial intelligence and robots doing everything that humans do.
No, ma'am, it does. In Arabic, the term an-natiq signifies both speech and reason. In
but
Arabic,
is there more to humans than just speech and reason? Like the spiritual...
I think that's a great deal, ma'am. That's a great deal.
I mean, are we limiting humans? I mean, I feel uncomfortable with that description of humans as... Even if we say speech and reason.
What else would you like?
I don't know. I mean, I feel there's this dimension, which leads me to my other question also. Before I forget, this concept of the shire having this connection. If you could, before we end this, give us some, give me some something to read about where this came about, because so many of the poets we've seen. And you mentioned some of them, but I mean, as I think I've shared with you before, I'm very interested in Iqbal and his poetry. I mean, he was not a prophet. He was, but it conveyed that. I mean, it almost said that the poetry came to him at night, almost like ilham. So where did this come from? And I mean, has somebody written about it? The Majnoon, the Kahin, all that description. That you were...
Well, there's a lot of things there. First of all, I think that if you define, and this is in all these logic books that would say that insan, man is a rational animal. Animal means that he's alive. Haywan, it just means living being. And he is as a living creature, he is distinguished from all other living creatures by the virtue of speech. Now, speech involves reason. I don't care what anyone says. Monkeys cannot talk. And they cannot communicate with sign language. They've learned through a simple Pavlovian kind of stimulus response over a long time to respond to certain stimuli, to mimic certain sort of signs in sign language. That's all it is. Similarly, computers. A computer will always need a programmer. It doesn't matter how sophisticated the software or the program is, there is no way to make a machine distinguish universals. It is impossible. And even some of the simplest sayings, simplest sentences in English cannot be interpreted without another human being. They can't be, even sometimes if you write them down also, even, you write them down, it won't be understood. Maybe you have to add punctuation, but if you say something, that's tremendous meaning. So, for example, you're writing with so, comma, you're, in other words, Y-O-U, apostrophe R-E, are here. So you're here. Now imagine. So you're here. So you're here. There's pitch, there's intonation, there's a whole social linguistic thing that goes. It works better in Urdu. Aage. Aage. Acha. Aage. Again, it means like you're late, something's happened, there's some, and it can have a whole world of meaning. Imagine a wife saying that to a husband. Now that has a whole context, maybe stretching back decades, right? With all sorts of things. It's very complicated. Language is not that simple. How are you going to program a robot to do that? And that's a very big thing in the popular culture. So many films have been made about this robot and that robot. There's the famous iRobot. There's, it's just not going to happen. It's like a big fantasy of those geeks. It will never happen. It's impossible. Now, poetry and the origin of poetry. How do people get poetic inspiration? Yes, there's lots of people who have written on this. This is not my field. I know that many people have written on it, but I couldn't cite to you a single book because I've never bothered to go into it. But the relationship between poetry and philosophy, that is there in someone named Heidegger. Heidegger is very interested in the connection between poetry and ancient, but he's a very idiosyncratic writer. I suppose you'd have to read him in the original German, supposedly, but people often say they prefer it, even people who know German say, well, I'd rather read him in English if they know English. He's a very difficult guy. And he also, reads very well. Sometimes you read and you think, wow, this is really beautiful, but then you wonder, like the comment that's made here, and it more applies to Heidegger, did he actually say anything after reading all that? So, he has something, there's an anthology of writings relating to poetry, Poetry, Language, and Thought, I think by Heidegger, you might find interesting, but I'm sorry, I really can't help you too much there. There is a study on crazy people in medieval Islam, and then people who are possessed. It's a whole study on the Majnun, but I don't have the details. I'd have to, yes, what was that called? It was published. Let me search because, if I was in the Princeton University Library, I could probably find it very quickly. Actually, I have to retract that comment because they reorganized the whole library. There are different ways of classifying books. And Princeton used to have a system called the Richardson system, where you didn't even need a catalog. If you knew how sort of the thing was organized, you could just walk around and figure it out. And there were plenty of people who were too lazy to figure it out, so it became kind of funny. People thought I had the whole thing memorized, and I didn't. I just knew how to use the Richardson system. So, anyway, I'll have to search for it. I'll ask a few people. There's an actual study of that phenomenon in medieval Islam. Yes. Well, now things have sort of unraveled now, but let me make a final point about Parmenides. If you actually go to the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy on Plato's Parmenides, the dialogue, not the person, there is an explanation. All of the deductions, there are a bunch of deductions that take place, okay? It's on page 15. And they are summarized in that article. If you print it out on American size paper, it's page 15. On British size paper, it might be different. So it's a section called How to Save the Form. The article is divided into sections. Section 5, How to Save the Forms, the Plan of the Deductions. So essentially, he starts out, there are a number of logical possibilities. And you end up with what's called a tetralemma, 4 sort of possibilities. So if the one is, then you have a bunch, 4 things. And then if the one is not, you have 4 more, and that gives you 8. So he's just constructing a kind of argument on the idea that if you take the one as a Platonic idea, what you would need to argue for that as an example, as opposed to roundness or truth or justice. That is what is at work there. And so he constructs a system whereby you reason in this way. And that's really what's quite good and original about it, because it also goes with these modalities of being according to Palmer. And that's why he's important in the history of ontology and is very important in the school of Platonism, because the ultimate question really is being. And being cannot be defined. Yet everyone has some sort of intuitive understanding of what it is. And being is also the most important question, because being encompasses everything. It encompasses everything that exists, and the most existing thing, of course, that is characterized by existence is God. So it's really the most important thing. And that's why Aristotle actually, supposedly the father of metaphysics, he wrote a book called The Metaphysics, a name which he never gave it and which he never used. So what did Aristotle refer to it as? He called it Al-Falsafatul Ula, first philosophy, because it's concerned with first things, the primary things. And the most primary thing is being, because it's the most primary of our intuitions. And it's the most fundamental of things, because it can't be defined, because it is the basis of all definition. He also called this subject, which he wanted to study, he also called it by the name of theologia, theology, which means talking about God. So it's very clear that he identifies wujud with Allah. Now, theologia, literally in Greek, means talking about God. That's really where you get this thing, ilmul kalam. It's kalam about this and kalam about that. And so a logos, or a discourse, or a discussion about a topic, that's why you have biologia, the science of life. Because it's talking, it's a discussion, it's a discourse about life, the principle of life, biology. So that's how we get this ology suffix in our language. That's where it originates, where it comes from. And this also sheds some light on something which is made much of by the Orientalists. Plotinus, remember I told you about this later figure in Platonism? He had a number of treatises, which are called the Enneads, the treatises grouped in 9, where he talks about the One. Now these were translated really kind of in a paraphrased translation into Arabic. But it seems only the last bit of them were translated, I think the last half of them. So there are 6 groups of 9, so the last 3, so 4, 5, and 6. The last half of the book gets translated into Arabic. Now that book was known as the Theology of Aristotle. And the Orientalists love to go on and on about, these Muslims, it was translated, these Muslims, they got it wrong, Aristotle never wrote such a book. Well, first of all, the translation was by a Christian, so it's not the Muslims. Then they say, well, it was the Arabs. Okay, fine. The Arabs didn't know what they were doing. They never, of course, put it in such stark terms, but that's what they mean. What doesn't seem to occur to them is that it's not the title of a book. It may not be the title. It may express what Aristotle thought about it. Well, Aristotle never said this. Well, Plotinus was long before these learned men from Oxford and Cambridge and Harvard and Yale and so forth. And he may have had a better idea. We don't have the manuscripts. They never get into these deep, profound issues. Maybe that's how it was known. Maybe that's how it was understood. We don't know. The Platonic school, we don't have an isnad to the Platonic school now. There's no living embodiment of the Platonic tradition anymore. It died out. Where did it go? Well, it went wherever it went. But a lot of people became Muslims. A lot of people realized that Islam was the next iteration of this primordial wisdom. Suhrawardi has a very interesting sort of take on this. He says that this wisdom is eternal. It's an ancient wisdom. It goes back to ancient times. The ancient Persian sages also understood what Islam is talking about, as did the ancient Greeks. And he calls this the leaven of the ancients, the leaven or the leaven of the khamiratul. Actually, he calls it the leaven of eternity, khamiratul azal. That this is a primordial wisdom. That's very different from what Shuan and Hussein Nasr and so forth would like you to believe. There is a primordial and perennial wisdom, but it's not the way they're saying it is. Because there's really nothing else to teach. The metaphysical truths are the same. Their sharias and so forth have changed. and there's a particular system which you have to follow now, which we as Muslims will say is Islam. But this primordial wisdom has always been there. So that is what the importance of Parmenides as a dialogue and as a figure. That he's the first to really understand, it would seem in Western civilization anyway, these modalities of being and existence, and that he has this thing in the dialogue of Parmenides, which is very important for later argument.
Before
yes,
you are going to leave, right?
Yeah.
The next class, decide on this.
It's going to be here.
And I'm questioning. Do you want to hear? And I can try to arrange a location, a masjid if you want. I can get a classroom or something like that. I mean, it's up to. I leave it up to you. Okay.
This is very far for everyone, I think.
See, here's a question. If everybody wants an alternate, this is very uncomfortable to sit. No board, nothing.
Echo.
So yeah, and I can find a classroom with Epic and let everybody know if that's fine with everybody.
I live very close to Epic, so it's very good for me. But you know, we would have to have unanimous agreement.
Yeah, that's it. It's a unanimous agreement.
I'm
fine, but that would be nice. Yeah.
You're okay. What about you? Okay. What about you? What about you? Okay. What about you? Okay. So I will take the responsibility of the classroom. Okay. Look, now you read email, right? All of you.
I always check my email. Yeah. That's the best way to contact me.
Right? Okay. If I'm able to succeed, I'll inshallah I'll get back. You'll have board and everything.
Good. Yes. I'm here until my wife comes and picks me up, so it's fine with me.
I have to go marry. Thank you so much for your time.
Can you make that available to us? Where's the email list?